if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. As long as I don't think they're scary questions, we will ask them. So I suppose like they could ask Kacen if you're like a fan of the Gremlins or something, which is technically a scary movie, but
Is it?
I mean, kind of, right? Like that they if you put water on a mogwai, like more angry mogwais come out. That's kind of scary.
Is it weird that I have not seen this movie?
No,
I
not
think it
really.
may be weird.
It is
You're
not weird. I didn't see my first Gremlins movie until I was in my 20s, and by that time I had watched them in reverse order, which is why they're not funny. Which is why they're not scary to me. They're primarily funny, but
Did you mean to watch them in reverse order, or were you like at when you got to the first one, like, oh, I've been watching
no,
this
it was
many
like
times?
other people were watching it, and I was like, okay, I've never seen Gremlins before. I might as well. And they were like really surprised that I hadn't, but they had already begun
Mm,
Gremlins 2, and I was like, okay, cool. I guess we're just doing the thing like this now. And after finishing Gremlins 2, I was like, is this a horror movie or is this just a comedy with lots of blood? Um,
well, especially
sometimes it,
Gremlins 2, because Gremlins 2's got
exactly.
the like sophisticated academic gremlin who goes on a talk show and gives like a whole like interview. I can't even remember what talk show it is, but yeah. So that one is extra silly. Uh, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say they're scary, really scary movies. I mean, yeah.
I don't know. I am looking at a photo of something that does. I looked it up on my phone, and now I'm like, this looks pretty terrifying. I'm not gonna lie, but I'll take your word on it.
I mean, the puppets are
If it
like
comes
they're
to
scary
that.
looking. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they are scary looking puppets to be sure. But it feels like, I mean, it feels like it was constructed. Like, you know how there's a difference between a horror movie written for adults and a horror movie written for children?
Mhm.
Um, Gremlins 1 seems like a horror movie written for children, and Gremlins 2 feels like a comedy written for adults.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, just imagine like you're having a conversation about, like the intricacies of the Renaissance with one of those. Like he's wearing glasses, he's got a tie on. Like he's not that scary anymore, I guess. What do I know? I've never interacted with a gremlin.
But aren't you blessed?
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
But how does the ability to win wars translate into the power to, say, create a flower?
That's an interesting quote to pick. That's an interesting choice,
It
Brandon.
was one of my favorite lines in the whole book. It's one of these, like, this entire book is rad, but that one stood in my brain, and I was like, okay, cool. I have a lot of thoughts about abstract power now, and I'm gonna ask at least one of those questions tonight.
ooh,
Excellent.
excited.
That's very exciting. Okay, well, with that in mind, I'm Shaun.
I'm Brandon.
And today we are joined by the celebrated Kacen Callender, author of multiple novels for children, teens, and adult, including the National Book Award winning King of the Dragonflies, which I have read, and it's very nice. The best selling novel Felix Ever After, and our feature for today, their new novel from Tortine, Infinity Alchemist. Welcome to the show, Kacen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome.
But before we begin, a friendly reminder to all of the lovely people in chat and listening to us on the podcast. We like to hear from you whenever you have anything to share. So please feel free to talk to us about this and past episodes at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. Join us on Discord so you get to talk to us live. And become a Patreon supporter so you can financially support the work that we are doing and have your own say in what kind of content we make for you. It is very helpful for us to know what you all want and what you all think about the content that we are making. And if you are with us live right now on Twitch, feel free to ramble at us in the chat. We like to hear from you.
Perfect. Well, We have our first question then, which is the big one. So, Kacen, what is the Infinity Alchemist?
Infinity Alchemist is about 18-year-old Ash, who, in a world where alchemy is the source of magic for the um, blah. I try to get this summary like memorized and perfected, and inevitably, every time I'm asked that question, it falls apart. But basically, in a world of alchemy, the main character Ash is rejected from the Lancaster College of Alchemic Science, and he ends up working there instead. And one day he's caught illegally practicing alchemy by a professor and is blackmailed into helping that professor, Ramsey Thorne, find what is called the Book of Source, which is supposed to grant its reader all-knowing power. Let's put it that way. And hijinks ensue.
I like how you describe it as hijinks.
Yeah.
Adventures, hijinks.
Going through
Hijinks
doors
makes it sound like the stakes are not high.
I feel like I need to print that summary out somewhere instead of like trying to remember it every single time. But anyway.
It's gotta be tough, yeah, to be like I have to remember my what my book's about, even though you've written it, and it's like, well, but I suppose at a point your brain just gets like frazzled from like I've been thinking about this book for a year.
Well, I was actually thinking before this interview, what tends to happen that people don't realize is I wrote this book like 3 years ago, and right now I'm about to work on the sequel. And since then, I've written like 2 other books. So of course, the book is still on my mind. I'm still like thinking about it as I write the sequel, but I think people forget that writers have like finished the book 5 years ago and are asking questions sometimes, and they're like, "Oh, who was that character again?" Hopefully, that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Like, you have to think about everything that you have already done about the book years ago, and the fact that everything that is fresh in your mind are the things that are new and larger about that world that haven't occurred yet.
Exactly. So it's like, is that scene from the original book or the sequel I'm writing right now?
Or from the first draft.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
That's I mean, I hadn't really thought about that before, but you're completely correct that the scale of publishing does mean that you might be very removed from a book because you probably haven't worked on it in a while. Like, especially once it goes off to the printer, like you don't see that thing until it shows up in a box of books at some point.
Exactly.
So the one of the questions I wanted to start with was kind of a big one because one of the central spaces in this book is an alchemy school, a magic school, as it were. And throughout the book, you're exploring the sort of power relationships that exist there. And I was really curious if you could like talk about what made you interested in exploring this theme in particular in this work. Why this particular theme?
It's funny because you just mentioned the magic school. It did start with the spark of, had multiple first inspirations, but one of them was J.K. Rowling and her rejection of transgender people. And I used to be a huge Harry Potter fan. So I originally wanted to write a school about acceptance of trans people, like the magic setting. And it kind of spiraled into a question of like, who gets to have the power to say that people get to be accepted? And then it continued to spiral into questions of like, well, what is power? Is it just the power to like control other people? Is it an internal power? So it just continued to like evolve into multiple different questions. But one of the sparks was the conversation around like rejection and who has the power to reject and who has the power to accept, and it doesn't even matter, like, as long as we have the power to accept ourselves, does that even matter?
Well, that's a deep question.
I think societally it can matter if some people, marginalized people, are being affected by that, but in terms of like, okay, so J.K. Rowling rejects me, do I love myself anyway? Like, I feel like that's what I was trying to get at a little bit more with Ash's story.
That is something like Ramsey Thorne basically tells Ash at one point in the book, like, isn't your power from within, and isn't it more important to like accept from within rather than expecting everybody else to sort of accept you as whatever you happen to be? which I did think was a very interesting moment in the book. That I wasn't expecting from Thorn of all people, because Thorn for much of the book is rather prickly. So
Super prickly. One of my favorite things to do for character development is to have people who are so hypocritical, because I feel like every single human is super hypocritical. I might be like whining and complaining about something that someone said or did to me yesterday, and then turn around without thinking about it and do the exact same thing to another person. So anyway, yeah, Ramsey's very hypocritical.
very much so.
Yeah, like in that context, like one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about um Ash and Thorn's, like the very nature of their relationship is Thorn is, for for want of a better way of describing, actually being a teacher in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
In most moments in the book, generally wants Ash to know how alchemy works and to think more deeply about uh how Ash uses it. But is also a criminal, is also like doing a bad thing to Ash.
Yeah.
Um and like there's a moment very early in the book as well where Ash is like literally like, I know alchemy. I literally possess the power to change my own fate, and yet I am beholden to all of these people who are making decisions for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that that observation is a very interesting one to make. But one of the other things that I like about the dichotomy of how power is viewed in this work is the idea that alchemy is this dangerous, volatile um, force in the world that you can use to enact violence
Mm-hmm.
upon people. But a lot of that violence is itself beautiful, or people ask questions about what alchemy can do that can be healing or wondrous in that sense. Like the fact that the first time you see someone die as a result of alchemy is because flowers are sprouting from their neck. Um,
Mm-hmm.
is like a radical kind of image in that sense. And I kind of wanted to ask how you viewed that dichotomy between a thing that is being used um as a force for like enacting one's forceful will upon other people, but that people are discussing that power in the terms of what it can do to change the world more radically in a more
Mm-hmm.
uh like a more benevolent sense, even though that
Mm-hmm.
rarely happens.
Mm.
Yeah, that was a beautiful analysis. Thank you. I think that basically alchemy is the way that I do look at like the energy of humanity and the energy of existence, period. So everything you just described is humanity, is like what humans do, right? Like we have the power to be these beautiful people who are healing and who take care of each other, but we tend to also have a dichotomy of becoming very violent. So in the book, I was also, I think, trying to explore like how do we get as this like human race, as this one like unit of energy, to get to a place where we are um thinking about healing and internal healing and helping others, and how do we start to get to a place where violence isn't even a part of the conversation anymore. We don't necessarily need to hurt others because we've already found, um in my perspective, enough like internal healing to not feel the need to hurt others. um but yeah, I think that that's just a kind of philosophical thought that started to leak a little bit more into the book.
Well, that's interesting. Because now it makes me think of Thorn in a different way here. The
Mm-hmm.
That Thorn. So I had a question here that's about like Thorn as this figure who should be the complete beneficiary of their wealth, basically. The fact that they come from a wealthy family, they shouldn't always benefit. But it seemed like you were complicating Thorn by the fact that Thorn's family has become pariahs, and so, well, they've been executed. So like that's maybe pariah as being too kind of a word. And so Thorn, by extension, also is now like people kind of keep a distance and see Thorn a
Mm-hmm.
little bit differently, and that's obviously contributing to why Thorn is so prickly, because Thorn has their own issues as well
Mm-hmm.
as Ash does, and that that maybe makes Thorn seem like this individual who maybe always has it together, but is down deep down, exactly as you say, this person with issues that need to be resolved, pain and suffering and so on, healing that needs to take place. And
Absolutely.
that to some degree is everybody in your book, just in different ways.
Yeah, I think everybody who exists, yeah. The characters in the books and real humans. And I feel like, yeah, that's just my personal take on it, that we all have kind of like something to heal and to kind of like use as a tool of like evolution. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that email ding just went off, but
you're fine.
Okay.
Well, it's interesting. So you would kind of see then that, you know, insofar as this book and perhaps its sequel in the future are trying to explore making the world a better place, whether that's our heroes doing it or the forces of the universe, that can be hindered perhaps by our inability to find that healing, whatever it is that we need, because that could lead us down paths to doing harmful things to others, or becoming an assassin in the middle of the night that's following people after a pub, for example.
Assassin. I have not met many assassins. Maybe exactly. Never know if I have or not. Yeah, that is my general take on it. Yeah, basically that's my general take on it.
Okay. So can I ask then, we kind of talked magic school and I wanted to come back to it, but in a different way. I really appreciate, like sometimes you read about magic schools and stories and like they'll mention like, oh, there's those wealthy families that can take advantage. And then like it's there, but it's not really explored all that much. And in this book, I mean, so much of this book is about how very much the educational institution is like embedded into the wealth structure of this society. And I thought that was a very interesting approach to sort of tearing down the idea of like the majesty of the magic school. Like it should be this space that's beautiful, wonderful, but it's also a site of, entrenched power and people's familial engagements. And while I imagine you weren't thinking about this right now, but like a bunch of US states literally just banned legacy admissions to their universities right as I was reading this book, and I was like, wait, hold on, what's going on here? And so I was hoping you kind of talking about that, like how you were exploring this sort of critique of wealth and entrenched power through essentially a school, a university, a training ground of education, basically.
Yeah, I do like the way that you just described that too. I think that the way that I was trying to approach it was wanting to give the world itself a little bit of a grittier feel to it. It was thinking about like in opposition to the childlike wonder of like other magic schools and other magic books that we read as children. Like this is what the grittier, realistic college setting would be like, which just reflects what we see in our own world, where I think a lot of millennials and Gen Zers are waking up to the fact that we were told that anyone can get into school and this is supposed to help our life as we get older, and we're kind of like, no, we've been lied to. So I think that kind of like comes through in the pages too, where it's like we're seeing that wealth will get you farther. Ash himself is like, I know that I'm talented. I know that I have the power. I just don't have the tools to hone it yet. If only you all would give me a chance. And he just isn't accepted, and it's because of his like family name. It's because he doesn't have that wealth. So yeah, I think I was just kind of like putting that into the setting of like this is a grittier world. It's not all magic and butterflies, but what was kind of like Brandon was saying earlier about first drafts, forgetting like like putting my mind thinking the first draft is what the current book is. I did actually have drafts where I was trying to go in that direction, and it just never worked. Like I kept on hitting a block of like, okay, the characters, it's a very like whimsical space. The characters are all very excited. Ash does get into the college. Class is about to begin, and I could never actually write past that first class. And it wasn't until I started writing a draft where Ash was rejected that the story just like started to fly forward. And I think it was because I realized that this is a story about rejection. It's about a story about learning about your own self-power, even in the face of other people, not just like the author I've been mentioning, but just society as a whole, like rejecting you. What do you do? How do you find that internal power? Anyway, so I think that once I found that theme and allowed that theme to illustrate what the book would be about more, the story really just started to fly forward.
I like that.
I think that
yeah. Oh, go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
think that that's particularly interesting because one of the things that drew me to the school setting was a kind of version of what Shaun described, but viewed through like the Caribbean post-colonial lens of how in our colonial history there were schools in the Caribbean, definitely schools in Trinidad where I live, where if you weren't the son of someone with power, you didn't go to a high school because they existed specifically for them. And I viewed that through that kind of lens of the history of academia being solely a unit of power, and still attempting to radicalize that image by telling the story of someone who would still, under any circumstances, be denied access, still stealing that access from that space and doing whatever is necessary to claim it for their own sake, which I thought was actually really impressive.
Thank you. Yeah. I did not know that about Trinidad, actually.
Oh no, yeah, like there are schools here that are still considered prestige
Oh my
schools
gosh.
because
Yeah.
when they were built, only white people could go there. And I'm
Oh
like,
boy.
maybe you want to distance yourself as far as possible from that kind of lineage, but
Yeah.
these things happen. I mean, it's the history of those spaces, and it's the history of education as a platform in general. And I think getting especially young readers accustomed to the idea that this was once the truth, but it is no longer the truth because you are valuable in the way that you seek your own knowledge and display your own knowledge is actually really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one last thing I want to say about education before we ask a different question.
Yeah, I needed to divert to the academic. I couldn't keep stealing the spotlight. I know very little.
Well, so there's a great moment in the book and I makes me want to actually just assign it as like the first reading in a composition class in college now, which is this bit where Thorn is explaining to Ash why it's important to learn the fundamentals. And I really appreciate that you did this, where you're like, oh, it's cool. You could like almost light someone's house on fire and you could do all these really amazing things. But like the reason to learn the fundamentals is, you know, you need to be able to control those things and be able to know when to break the rules, as it were. Because without that, you could, in this case, like you could light someone's entire house on fire and then that might cause other problems. And I'm kind of curious if you had any thoughts on like where that particular scene came from. I mean, to me, it seems like the obvious question is like, oh, it's like magic systems, right? Like, let's talk magic systems. But it also seemed to be that there's just so much more going on with how you wanted to explore like the very function and purpose of education. And I don't know if that's the case, but I'm really curious how you kind of think about this scene, even now after all these years.
Yeah, that scene for me was, I think it's I'm trying to say main and most at the same time. Its main purpose was a character study for both Ramsey and Ash. I really wanted to show how they both would react to the same idea of fundamentals in such drastically different ways. I wanted to show that they were on opposite ends of the spectrum, while also taking that as an opportunity to show just how like hypocritical that they can be, because here Ramsey is such a stickler for rules with fundamentals, but is messy and very like eccentric. And so it was mainly a character study. But what you're saying about education, like I wonder if subconsciously, it's not that I thought about this until this moment, so I could just be winging it right now, but I kind of feel like it's interesting thinking about what you just said and the scene where Ash like just blows up the entire school. Not the entire school, it was just a few buildings. But anyway, like the idea of restricting yourself to the fundamentals, like he didn't have control in that moment, but and yet that was where he was able to find the most power. And even though that got him into so much trouble, it was like this explosion of power that was almost like symbolic of an explosion of his own internal power. Like, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just, but I feel like maybe there's something there symbolically where it's like, yeah, maybe the fundamentals are a little restricting for certain people, and maybe they're helpful for others because certain people are. I have ADHD, so excuse me. But now I'm like jumping to the idea of writing and like specific processes that people say you're supposed to follow in order to write. And a lot of people not following those processes and being considered like, or craft is really the word I was trying to find, like not following specific craft rules. And so being like the people in quote unquote power, like mostly as I'm thinking in this specific context, like white Western people who do have the power to say, well, this is what's good and this is what's bad. And people who might be from other cultures writing something that doesn't follow those rules, quote unquote, being considered bad because their craft doesn't quite match up with that. So I guess I'm just thinking like rules in general maybe don't fit for everyone, and maybe that is limiting power in some way. That was a very long ramble, but
No,
I
that's
think you got what I was saying.
That's actually fantastic because you're completely correct. I've thought of two examples that you hear in writing conversations all the time as like the show don't tell rule that like some people adhere to, like it's like gospel. And then the other one is like the idea that it's not a story unless it has like conflict, right? Like in the sense of like fighting or some sort of like real big conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
yeah, I don't know if this is what you're talking about, but I do feel like there was a conversation maybe a couple of years ago that was just kind of going around in the writing community where it was like, I think the word people kept on using was fluff, like a story that's mostly fluff or all fluff isn't legitimate. And I was like, I love fluff stories. Why not? Like, why does it have to be? So anyway, I understand what you're saying. I agree.
no, you're
Fluff
completely
is
right.
good.
Yeah.
Sometimes we just need fluff.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's the a thing that like that comes up occasionally in the conversation, which is there's I can't remember the name of it, but there's a Japanese narrative structure that does not have what most Western writing would consider to be conflict.
Kisha Tenketsu.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and it's mostly people associate it with like what's the My Neighbor Totoro, which like has conflict, but it's not. It's like nobody's fighting. There's not like a war. There's no enemy to overcome. Yeah. It's just like
I need
almost
to
like a
look this
sequence of
up.
scenes. Yeah, it's a great movie. Yeah.
Oh no, not I mean, I actually have never watched My Neighbor Totoro, which is a complete that should be illegal. So I feel bad about that. But I was talking about, you said it's Kishiti Kontetsu. That's what you said it was?
Kisho Tenketsu.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'll look that up. That's cool.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's very interesting because obviously they're like it's referring to the thing that we otherwise consider as conflict in stories just being the fact that something has changed in the narrative. The fact that momentum is occurring doesn't need to be about having an antagonist just attempting to overcome a circumstance. And I think that that's a valuable writing lesson for people to know. But I was also going to say, in the academic sense, one of the things that struck me about that was the idea that you can only learn or prove that you are learning a thing in an academic space one way. Which is one of the other things that I liked a lot about that observation. Again, for young people specifically to come to terms with the fact that sometimes you don't need to do things the way people tell you to do it in order to prove that you are learning something, that you know how it is being applied, that you should still be willing to challenge yourself in those ways because you might blow up a couple buildings. But the idea that you are not learning or not learning correctly otherwise is unhelpful to actually getting people to do the things that are necessary for them to grasp those concepts.
You're speaking to my neurodivergent soul right now. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking to all the like everyone who's neurodivergent is completely different, but they're just like an example of like trying to learn in school and teachers like saying you must learn this way, you have to like take notes this way, you have to study this way. And as a neurodivergent mind, ADHD, I learn completely differently. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. Because like
Tobias,
the thing that I'm thinking first and foremost, and I'll be brief, short.
no, you're fine. You're fine.
Yeah, but like, when I started reading this, a lot of the same magical school stuff that you've read, Kacen, a part of what attached me to those kinds of books were this is the kind of school I wish I would go to, not necessarily because of the magic, but because I'm intrigued by the idea that I can learn in these new, interesting ways.
Yeah.
And then like reading this, reading Infinity Alchemist, like gave me a thing that I wish I had also gotten when I was younger, which is the idea that I would have loved to learn from a teacher who was willing to tell me, or was willing to at least be challenged with the idea that I don't need to learn this way all the time. And that the questions that I'm asking or the reasons why I'm asking them are just as valid as however the syllabus is being prepared. So yeah, I dug this a lot.
Thank you. Yeah.
I do want to jump back just slightly because talking about like neurodivergence, I know that like Tobias Bickel has talked about dyslexia and the impact it's had on his writing process. He's talked about it publicly a bunch of times, so it's not like I'm revealing state secrets here. But and yeah, he talks a lot about like having to learn how to deal with the fact that he's going to misspell words and that those are going to come up in his work and like processes he has to come up with to sort of address those, because generally turning in a work full of many typos to like, you know, your first editing gig or whatever is going to be frowned upon. And I can't remember if I don't think he got formal. I think he had just like figure it out, because I don't think that was really, it wasn't like they had magic methodologies in place for him to figure a lot of that out, which I think is kind of somewhat of what we're kind of talking about. Like, here is this character Ash who isn't themselves per se neurodivergent, but is coming to learning this thing differently than how it is typically taught, and still having to figure out basically on his own how to do it with very little support, at least until Thorn shows up, who offers support is a word I guess you could use. I'm teasing. I love Thorn.
Me too.
Yeah. There wasn't a question there. I'm sorry. I was just rambling. I just thought this
No,
is
it's okay.
an interesting point.
I was following. Yeah.
Rambling is good. Rambling is healthy.
Yeah.
So I wanted to hit on another theme that shows up in the book, which is House Loon's belief, like thought process about alchemy as a practice. Essentially being that they are quite a bit more restrictive of it, that they see it as a negative force in society, as like actively blasphemous in that sense. Which in the magic school space is its own kind of thing, because the relationship between the thing that is magic and everything else is a kind of interplay that a lot of those works deal with a lot, but also leaning very strongly into that religious extremist sense of there is a group of people who think that this is bad and wrong and should no longer be practiced, and that those people have power in society in the exact same way as the communities whose children are going to this school is actually very interesting. So I kind of wanted to pick your brain about that decision in particular to portray this conflict.
Yeah. So originally, alchemy was also a symbolic of queerness and transness. So it's very, I feel like it's okay to say it's a pretty obvious parallel between House Loon and Christianity and homophobia and transphobia that so many people are dealing with today, and using their kind of like scripture and their ideas of what is right or wrong based on what House Loon calls the creator rather than God. And I was also playing a little bit with the real world sense of like what is spirituality and what is religion and those differences. And I did want to kind of like look into alchemy, a magic-based system that's based in science. So I've been trying to not say this out loud too much because one of these days I feel like I'm just going to get an email from someone that's like, you do not know what you're talking about. And you know what, person, you are right. But this magic system is supposed to be based on quantum physics. And it's, I did some research for it, but basically the idea that energy is what creates like the quantum field, and that's what alchemy is. It's like the alchemic field. We are all a part of alchemy. We're all a part of energy. Using that thought process, that's why so many the characters throughout who aren't really of House Loon say we're all source, we're all a part of source. That's basically saying we're all God, we're all a part of God. We are the particles of God, we are God. Whereas create like House Loon and what I do feel like a lot of religions today, not to say like individuals who are religious are wrong. I'm saying that there can sometimes be a flip into the idea of like God is outside of ourselves, whereas even I myself am not even necessarily religious, but the Bible itself even says like the kingdom of God is within. I do feel like that kind of is pointing to the idea that we are more a part of God than we realize. And the idea that there's an outside force that's telling us who has the power to say who is right and wrong and who is evil and who is unworthy. I think that's all a topic I really just wanted to touch on. And I do not even remember what the original question was.
Yeah.
You are answering the question. You are very well answering the question.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
And I like that observation that you made that even in the scriptural sense, there is an understanding that God is an element within ourselves. Because I think at least I am also not very religious, but a lot of the reading that I did when I stopped being religious very young was about that kind of understanding that the idea that God or the spirit or the things that are spiritual are external to us is both new to our understanding of spirituality and just generally unhelpful.
Absolutely.
And I think having characters whose understanding of source in the work be less about how it attempts to give them power or how they can tap into it to gain power, and more about that kind of self-understanding, and through that self-understanding they do reveal their own power, was very revealing of that queer metaphor for me, but also just kind of enlivens the overall conflict, in that there are people who think that this thing is bad and wrong because they don't want to understand that there are people who are learning more about the thing that you call God than you are, because they're willing to ask those questions and think very deeply about those things rather than be restrictive.
Yeah, and you know, even what I was speaking about earlier with hypocritical, everyone's a hypocrite. I almost feel like that is just the energy balance that's trying to balance itself out. So some certain people will say that they are so religious and they praise God, and so because of that they are good, but they are not able to see the God within others around them, and so they decide that they are the ones who are evil and unworthy. And yeah, I feel like that's something I just wanted to explore, like the idea that we are all so incredibly worthy because we are elements of God. Every single
And
one
that
of
the
us.
people who don't want you to know that are the people who benefit from you not being worthy and not from anything else.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, that hypocrisy, I mean, it's layered throughout this book. I mean, you basically indicated this is a thing you really wanted to explore. It leads people to, really horrific conflicts that some of them don't want to deal with within themselves, that they are professing one belief publicly and yet doing seemingly the opposite thing in private. And as you point out, right, this hypocrisy is certainly found all over our own culture. We're using the example of, certain groupings of religious individuals. I remember the moment when Ted Haggard like was found, as he spent years railing about like drugs are bad and gay people are bad, and then it turns out he's having a gay relationship with a drug dealer, and it's like, you
I actually did not know that.
yeah, like it is a whole. There's a lot more to it, but like it was wild the moment that happened, and I was like, this is bananas. I mean, you sat out here telling us that if we don't agree with you, we're all like horrific sinners and horrible things, and here you are doing the very thing you tell us is evil, and it's like,
Yeah.
maybe you were the one with the issue the whole time.
And I kind of want to, I'm trying not to put moral judgment on the idea of hypocritical. I'm trying to like normalize it, because after this, I'm about to do something at myself. Like on it. No. I mean, like, I mean, like, as soon as this interview, I'm sure I'm going to do something so incredibly hypocritical, and I'm going to be like, oh, I was just so upset at this person for doing the exact same thing yesterday. Like, it's just something that's so, I don't know, maybe, like, I think I'm getting a little heady here, but I almost feel like it's an opportunity for us to look at every single person again as like someone who is human and worthy, regardless of the mistakes they make, because we're about to make the same mistake we're angry at them for.
No, yeah. Like, in that exact same comparison that Shaun was making, I was like, the thing that we're supposed to learn about Tadhega is not that he was wrong and therefore should be punished. It's that he would be better off and would be making a whole lot of other people better off and more comfortable in themselves if we had healthier conversations about these things. If we were willing to be more open and understanding about people rather than restrictive and judgmental. And I think the nature of the conflict in this book is a lot, but I think that this still does come down to that point that yes, these things are bad. Yes, this conflict should not have evolved in the way that it had. But all of these people are making the decisions that culture or their circumstances have put them in a position to believe is valuable, even though everyone else is watching that hypocrisy take place.
Yeah. I do love that you guys keep reminding me that this is supposed to be about the book. Thank you for that.
You're fine.
Sometimes we forget. Sometimes we also forget. And then I look at the time and go, we should go back to our job is to help you move copies. So if we stop talking about the book, we fail you. You could talk about whatever you want.
No. I, as an author, I should also remember that. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, and I guess all about like this hypocritical conversation. I've been kind of like wanting to bring Callum into the mix also, because he's such a symbol of like this character who is trying his best to do everything that he thinks he's supposed to do. In his heart, he really doesn't want to do any of it, and his actions from the first like flashback, I think, where we're introduced to him, have just been incredibly hypocritical. But his learning and growth has been like letting go of the idea of who he thinks he's supposed to be. But it's funny going back to the conversation of like, is this in the first book or the sequel? I think it's okay to talk about the sequel a little bit. We do see a little bit more of that kind of like almost backlash, hypocriticalness to the idea of him like finally becoming who he wants to be. And maybe I should stop there, because I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about the sequel yet.
Well,
we're interested to learn more about the sequel, but
but we also don't want you to get in trouble with your publisher. So
yeah.
Well, related to this question then is, or this concern we're talking about, it seems on some level that by exploring the ways that people can be hypocritical and we can, do harm to other people and all of these things that come kind of embodied in that process, is there's an element of we're kind of leading us towards being empathetic towards these individuals, in part because it's in all of us, and then in part because people do change. They maybe don't change radically all the time, but they may change. They may, change their mind about something, or they may realize they've done wrong, or they may identify their hypocrisy, perhaps. Even in this book, that happens a number of times. The very first time we meet Thorn, there's no reason for us to think Thorn is anything but just exactly what Ash thinks. And there are multiple times when Thorn, like a little soft side comes out as the book progresses, and you start to see that Thorn is actually more complicated here and has his own hypocrisies, or their own hypocrisy, excuse me. And yeah, so I guess like to some degree what you're doing is you're really exploring this as a way of getting us to be empathetic towards those who, because we're not perfect, I guess, and to some degree
Absolutely.
change is necessary.
Yeah. And with Ramsey, any pronoun is fine, so you don't have to worry. For me, my
Right.
only thought is whatever pronouns the last time I saw Ramsey, which for me is actually he, so that's okay. But exactly what you were saying. And I think that's why the idea of source also just became like a major theme in the book, because if following the rules of source, then we're all source. Exactly right now, we are all that pure love, that pure energy. Everything that kind of like surrounds us, including like this physical body, all of the traumas that we had that lead to us making mistakes because we're not really seeing how that trauma that happened when we were 5 years old is making us want to push people away and hurt them. Like all of that kind of thing. That was just a quick example, but all of that is just kind of like a cloud around the sun in my perspective. And sorry to get a little dark, but when we die, the clouds go away and we remember, oh, we're the sun. It would be nice, I think, if we're able to remember that we're the sun. And I'm actually looking at the sun on my screen right now. And I'm like looking at every person and realizing, and for me, that's what empathy is. It's realizing whatever word you want to use, whether it's source, God, universe, energy. It's like I'm looking at something so pure and magnificent, and any mistake that they make is just a cloud that came from, in my perspective, I don't know if this is true or not, honestly, but I feel like any kind of hurt that we want to do to others or that we accidentally do to others, it's usually linked to trauma, including intergenerational trauma.
I'd agree
I could be
that
incorrect
that's true.
about that, honestly, but
I don't think you're completely off base. I think to a large degree, if not in an absolute sense, then as a nice shorthand, that's probably true.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have to ask this question then because you brought it up, Kacen, and I was curious from a writing perspective, especially because you mentioned that Thorn basically says in the book at one point, right? You can use whatever the you knew me as the last time you saw me, because
Mhm.
Thorn's gender presentation switches throughout the book. And the first time that happens, you have one chapter where you use she, and then there's one chapter where you use he, and it takes a little bit before that's sort of an explanation's offered for that. And I was very curious about why that kind of approach, where it wasn't like you front loaded all the world building that explained this. You just sort of had it happen naturally in the narration. And I'm kind of curious, what was the impetus for that, or was that a difficult process, or that just come naturally?
I think that the way I think about world building is I mean, the narrator for this was a third person, but the narrator for me is almost like a historian. In my head, I'm just thinking like it's a historian who's kind of like going through all of these um, scenes that have already happened. So I think about it from the perspective of like that narrator, or even if it was a narrator that was actually like Ash first person or Ramsey first person, what do they already know that would be like really repetitive and kind of weird for them to just say? Like it would be kind of weird for me to say, Brandon, who was wearing a red shirt, like the first time you meet Brandon, but um, maybe like 3 chapters later, it's just natural to kind of like slide that red shirt in, and because it's something that kind of like came up naturally. So I think in the book, it wasn't really natural to explain, because that's the other thing, like the queerness and the transness in this book is so normalized. It's not something that really needs to be brought up. It was only brought up for Ash's purpose because he was like, oh, it's actually kind of rare to like meet someone who shifts gender this much. Like, let me ask like about the pronouns. So it felt like a more natural moment for Ash rather than kind of like explaining immediately as soon as you meet Ramsey, because for this world, this was already normal.
I really love that touch, by the way. That
Thank
was
you.
it threw me for a loop for a second because I noticed the shift, and then as soon as I realized what was going on, I was like, oh, okay. We'll just keep going
Like,
now.
I enjoyed it as well, both as a reader and a writer, because I'm sure you've noticed there are like pockets of discourse around how pronouns are used
Mhm.
in work. Not with the deliberate intention to essentially erase queer perspectives in work, but just accidentally doing so through the lens of, well, this doesn't make sense to me, this doesn't very immediately read to me, I have no idea
Mm-hmm.
who this person is, and I'm like, I am following this very deeply.
Yeah.
I get it, and you are sharing this more interesting perspective on Thorn with me through that. And Thorn doesn't have to um speak for himself to me in order to qualify that. I'm learning that through the work itself, and I think that that's really nice. And I think I want more work to keep challenging readers in that way. Not because it is challenging, but because readers are perhaps a bit accustomed to not discovering that kind of um practice in the work that they read,
Mm-hmm.
and giving them more opportunities to get used to it. Um does the thing that we think stories do in the real world as well. It provides them the empathetic basis to do that in real
Absolutely.
life much more easily.
Absolutely.
Mm.
100%. Yep. Yeah, that's why I'm so drawn to books, is because you can literally become another person as you're reading, and you become, I mean, you don't adopt all those marginalizations if you're reading about a character who might be like more marginalized than your own like real identity. But for that split moment, you're feeling like that person's hurt when someone uses a slur against them. You're feeling that person's like joy when they finally find like a victory. Like it's just such a, books are magic. I'm sorry for being like really corny for a second, but it
You are
really
allowed.
translates you into like other people's heads and lives in a way that nothing else really can.
You're,
Yeah.
And
I mean, you're very
in that
correct. Yeah.
case, this book is one of the best of them, I think.
Oh,
I'm
thank
very
you.
much looking forward to more of this world.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
very much enjoyed this book and a lot of what it was doing. So thank you for a very interesting read.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, well, I think we need to ask you our two final questions, which are probably the least intense questions we've asked all day.
I mean, you say that when we ask writers the very first of these two questions, it is
That's
often
true.
very challenging.
Yeah, well, I think we kind of know the answer to this already, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is what are you working on at the moment? What can we expect, or what do you hope to bring to the world next, I suppose is the question.
So I am working on the sequel, waiting on the editorial notes, and I did finish a YA contemporary mystery that will be coming out with Abrams. Don't remember which year, but that will be coming up. And with Abrams, I have two graphic novels, scripts signed up, just the scripts, not an illustrator. I want to be, but not yet. So, but I have two graphic novels with Abrams in the next few years. And that's it for now.
Yeah, I'm very excited. YA mystery is a special part of my brain just immediately lit up, so I'm very excited for that as well.
Ooh.
Young people need to, like, we need to tell more stories to kids about kids solving mysteries, because kids are magically really good at that in ways that most adults are not.
I
So
agree.
yes, I'm very excited.
Thank you.
And our next question, of course, is where can folks find you? Where on the internet can people find more information about you and the work that you are making?
CacenCallender.com.
So I take it no other social media. You have
I do have
saved
a
yourself from the hostility of most other social media.
I really have, yeah. I realized my mental health, like honestly, really could not take social media anymore. And I did quit as an author. A couple of people have found me on TikTok. I'm just chilling over there as an illustrator, as a wannabe illustrator. So I guess if you want to find like my really bad art, and judge me for it, you can on TikTok, but
I won't
that's
judge
the only
you.
social media I have.
I mean, you're definitely a better drawer than me, and I haven't even seen it yet. So
You know what? Don't find me on TikTok. I just realized I don't want.
I'll take it out if you want me to take it out.
Maybe.
that's fair. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Kacen, for joining us today. It was a pleasure, and I'm very glad we could have you on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. All right, folks at home and watching now, wherever you happen to be. Again, if you'd like to suggest something, you have a comment, or you read this book and you'd like to let us know how much you liked it too, you can go to skiffingfanty.com/listener suggestions or skiffingfanty@gmail.com if you want to email us. We are Skiffing Fanty on most social places that exist, and we have a newsletter and a Patreon and all of those good things, and those are on our link tree, which is linktr.ee/skiffingfanty. Please support us on Patreon if you've got like $1 that you don't need for food. But if you need it for food, don't give it to us. You take care of yourself first. And then please rate the show. Brandon, where can folks find you?
Folks can find me almost anywhere on the internet at The Rising Tides. That's TITHES. At my newsletter, which is also my website at brandonobrien.xyz, and at speculatorsf.com, where we have just finished just aired our last recording of The Pitman Sculpture, our Apocalypse Quiz actual play.
Nice. And I'm at lots of places. I'm ShaunDuke.net. I'm obviously at this channel, Alphabet Streams, Tuesdays, Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central. And I have a link tree as well, which is /ShaunDuke if you want to find me places. I'm in lots of places. So with that in mind, as is required by the Skiffing Fanty bylaws, I have to make this podcast ending awkward. And
you don't have to.
Yeah, I do. It's written in the bylaws. You've read them. You signed the contract. What are you talking about? And by making it awkward, I just want to note that Brandon and I are officially going to star in a new buddy cop comedy. Cop is not what you think it is. It's actually a new slang term for cobbler. We're going to be cobblers who solve mysteries together.
I thought we weren't going to announce this so quickly, but I guess.
Well, too bad.
No networks picked it up yet, but we have filmed all 12 episodes.
Look, I've got a direct line to Jeff Bezos, so we got this on Amazon Prime coming to you soon. Yeah, this is what people want. This is what the people want. Okay, on that note, awkward ending ends.